So think about one of the things that we've said is important for developing a viable moral theory or a viable moral framework. One of those is consistency. In other words, trying to avoid contradiction as much as possible. There was a philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who was writing around the later part of the 18th century about ethics, about morality. And he wanted to try to come up with a consistent, coherent framework that is as thoroughly consistent as possible, and we call that Kantianism. So I want to start with a question. Think about the last time you either internally or vocally accused somebody of hypocrisy. A lot of the time, it maybe seems almost universal, maybe globally, we would say that there's something wrong morally about hypocrisy, saying that or criticizing or challenging other people ethically for doing something when I might do it myself, right? That's hypocritical, and we all seem to have a sense that it's morally wrong. And I'm going to explore a little bit why that's the case, based on Kantian reasoning. I want to refer a little bit back to something that is well known and that indicates that Kant's thinking wasn't entirely his own. He certainly made some very important new steps in philosophy and moral thinking, but this is something that a lot of people had been aware of in the past. You may have heard of something called the golden rule, right? Do to other people what you would have them do to you. And it's another way of saying that we should not be hypocrites. We should treat other people the way that we would want to be treated. All right, so expanding on that logically, or looking for how this can be derived through reason, is to say, to take a something that many of us accept already as well, which is the idea that everybody is equal in value. All human beings are created equal, if we want to use that phrase from the Declaration of Independence. If every human being has equal value, then that means that we should treat every person in an equal manner. We should not treat anybody with more favor than any other. We should apply the same principles universally. Now, that of course means that we should apply the same principles to ourselves, right? Because after all, you are, as an individual, you are a human being, equal in value to every other individual human being. So this is one of the logical bases, one of the logical premises that leads to the idea that hypocrisy is morally wrong because we are treating somebody in a way unequal to the way we think of ourselves. One of the ways that Kant fleshed this out was by distinguishing between human beings and everything else in the world, or objects, or things, or tools. Kant pointed out that human beings have intrinsic value. We are inherently valuable. Our value does not depend on whether we are productive, whether we are intelligent, not even necessarily on whether we are ethical or moral. Our value comes from the fact that we are human beings. To be a little bit technical, Kant considered that as based on the idea that we are rational moral agents. In other words, we as human beings are the only creatures on the planet that are moral agents. We are capable of forming a moral framework, a coherent moral system. And Kant thought that makes us more valuable than the animals, more valuable than objects or instruments or any other thing. So we have an intrinsic value. Everything else, on the other hand, has instrumental value. Instrumental value because it's valuable only in as much as it is useful, right, as it can be used. So, for example, my coffee mug, it has instrumental value. If it no longer it can be provided, if it no longer can act as an instrument for containing a delicious beverage, in this case, coffee, of course, once it can no longer do that, we may very well discard it. And there would be no moral problem with discarding it because it no longer is performing the function for which it's made, right? It has instrumental value. And the moment it no longer does, the moment it can no longer be used as a tool, we just throw it away or do whatever we want with it. Human beings are radically different. Human beings have intrinsic value. And so even if a human being ceases to be useful, of course that human being still has value, right? Now, to treat a human being otherwise, to treat a human being as an object, to treat a human being as if that person is an instrument, is absolutely morally wrong. Kant thought that was very morally problematic, because the moment we use somebody as a tool, the moment we manipulate somebody, the moment we get somebody to do things for our own purposes that's not to their benefit, we're treating that person as an object. We're treating them as a tool, as an instrument, as a thing. We are not treating them as a person. In other words, we are dehumanizing them. Right? And Kant thought that it was morally absolutely wrong. There's no question about the wrongness of that. Another way of framing that is to refer to it as the means end principle. In other words, we can only treat people as the end, the goal of our action. They can never be the means. They can never be the way we get something done. Rather, they must always be the focus, the target of our action. If we want to make something good happen, we can never use somebody to make that good thing happen. They always need to be the target of the good thing. Similarly, whether it's our own personal goal, we can never use somebody to attain our own personal goal because that dehumanizes them. That treats them like an instrument, right? So this is the means end principle. We can never use a human being as a means to an end. The human being always needs to be the end. The human being always needs to be the goal of our action. So another way of getting at these ideas is to reflect on action itself. Now, you may have heard the word tossed around, the idea of deontology. Deontology is a fancy word that refers to duty-based ethics, duty-based moral thinking. It is expressly not consequentialist. It's not based on the consequences or the effects of an action at all. It's only based on whether we are fulfilling our duty, whether we are meeting our obligations, whether we are fulfilling our responsibilities toward other people. And we can think of it this way without regard for consequences because we already know that other people are human. They are equal to us in value, and we already know that we should treat them the way we would want to be treated. It is our duty to do so because they are equal to me in value. So I have a duty to treat them as such. So when we think about actions, right? Kant said, in order for us to be consistent, remember, we're trying to be as consistent as possible. We're trying to avoid contradictions. And again, fleshing out the idea of non-hypocrisy. When I think about an action, performing some kind of action, let's say my action is taking a sip of this delicious coffee. Yes, it's delicious. That action, what I have done when I've performed that action, and what you and I do every time we perform an action, anytime we perform an action, we are implying, we are stating that that action is permissible, that that action is acceptable, right? Whenever you do something. So you drive a car, you are declaring to the world that it is morally okay to drive a car, right? And of course, it would be hypocritical if I were to drive a car and then say, but you may not drive a car, right? I would be a hypocrite, right? So Kant said, in order to be consistent, in order to avoid hypocrisy, we have to recognize that all of our actions imply some kind of moral principle. We are stating, I'm saying, this thing is okay, right? So every action implies a moral maxim, some kind of moral rule. I am justifying everything that I do, okay? All right, now, what that means is that I should live in a way, I should act in a way such that I would be perfectly fine with everybody else acting the same way. Right? Because remember, with every one of our actions, we are declaring a moral rule. We're declaring some kind of moral principle, a moral maxim. And so I should only act in a way where I would be okay with other people doing the same thing. This is sometimes called the idea of universalizability. Right? We should only do things that are universalizable. In other words, we could ask ourselves, with any action, would we be okay living in a world where everybody else performing that action is fine, whether we are justifying everybody else doing that. Okay, now think about some things that you would not like other people done to you, right? Other people doing to you. For example, lying, right? I would not like to live in a world where it were perfectly fine to lie to me, and I would have to recognize that it's morally okay. If I don't want to live in a world where lying is okay, that means that I must not lie, right? And remember, going back to the idea that an action constitutes or declares or creates a moral maxim. If I lie to somebody, I am saying to that person, implying to that person, and implying to the whole world really, that I think lying is okay if I lie to somebody. So Kant says this is how we know, not just think or guess or feel or intuit. This is how we know that lying is wrong, because we wouldn't want to live in a world where lying is okay. Now think about some of the other, basic moral standards that we follow. Stealing, right? Is stealing okay? We know that stealing is wrong. How do you know? Well, it's logically consistent. If I steal, I am declaring to the whole world, I'm creating a moral maxim that stealing is okay. Taking somebody's private property or personal property without their permission, that's what stealing is morally fine. So if I steal from somebody, I'm permitting everybody else in the world to steal from me because I have declared by stealing, I have declared that stealing is okay. So I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't steal because I would not want to declare to everybody else that stealing is okay. And of course, murder, well, it kind of goes without saying. So this leads to something that Kant described as the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative. Now this basically means that that stealing, lying, murder. He would also include promise breaking, which is a kind of lying about the future. Those are all categorically wrong. That means that every example of lying, every example of stealing, every example of murder, every case, with no exceptions, is categorically wrong, right? It is imperative that we refrain from lying, refrain from stealing, refrain from murder, categorically. All right. Now we can contrast that with what Kant called the hypothetical imperative. Just as a kind of a side note, a hypothetical imperative is something that does depend on a situation, right? Maybe an example is entering somebody's house, right? Well, it's hypothetical. It depends on it's a case by case basis. If the person has granted you permission to enter their house, then it's morally okay. If the person is not, then it's morally wrong, right? And there are lots of different circumstances where we could imagine entering somebody's house is something that one maybe ought to do in order to get something done, but in other circumstances, one ought not to do it, right? It's hypothetical. It depends, right? But the things that are categorically wrong are independent of any circumstances. It is always wrong to lie. That's a categorical imperative. It's always wrong to steal. That is a categorical imperative. Right. Now, what's interesting about Kantianism is that remember, Kant doesn't really care about consequences of an action, right? So this means that, and again, if we've categorically said that all cases of lying are wrong, well, we have this famous, well-known dilemma of the inquiring murderer, right? Or the inquiring thief, somebody uh, who has the intention of, say, murdering somebody, and you know that they have this intention, and then they ask you, do you know where this person is that they plan on committing this crime against, right? And let's say you do know where that person is, right? One of the analogies, a very tragic analogy, there's an application of this is, let's say during Nazi Germany, there is somebody who is graciously and charitably hiding some Jews in their attic, and the Gestapo comes and knocks on the door, and it says, "Are you hiding anybody in your house, or are you the only one who is in the house right now?" Right? These kinds of things. Would it be morally okay to lie in that case in order to save the lives of these people that you are protecting? Kant would say in that case, it's still wrong to lie. And this seems very bizarre. And this is one of the reasons why it's very rare to find somebody who is really a true, pure, dyed-in-the-wool Kantian, because in some of these cases, it would be very difficult to maintain a Kantian position and still maintain some kind of moral conscience, right? Kant had said that lying is categorically wrong. So in that case, where somebody is a inquiring murderer, it would still be wrong to lie to that person. Now, keep in mind why Kant says this, because if you lie to somebody, even if that person intends to commit a murder, if you lie to that person, you are using that person. You are treating that person as if they are less than human. You are betraying your duties to that person because they are a human being, equal to you, right? Now, of course, in that case, they have not yet committed the murder. Kant does address how we should respond as a society if somebody does commit a murder. Kant subscribed to a theory of punishment called retributivism. In other words, the purpose of punishment is to respond in kind to a crime. It's to make sure that the person gets what they deserve, as it were, right? That there is some kind of balance, that there is some kind of reciprocation that evens the score if somebody does something wrong. Kant thought that that was a logical way to respond. So if somebody murders, it's absolutely necessary that they receive the death penalty, according to Kant and according to retributivism. And so some people in defense of this view will say, well, if somebody commits murder, but then you don't kill the person who committed murder, basically you're saying that the murderer, the life of the murderer is more valuable than the life of the murdered, right? The person who got murdered, if you don't kill the murderer. Some people make this, and some people have made fairly compelling cases for it. Maybe I should say as a qualifier, I don't subscribe to that view. I'm not a retributivist. However, it's very important to remember that some people make very strong cases for the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. Right. In some other cases, let's say somebody attacks somebody and injures them, and in a way that blinds them. Right. Well, some people who follow a very strong retributivism would say that that person who committed the crime, who gouged out the person's eyes, well, they should have their eyes gouged out. And you might, just to refer to another scriptural example of this, this refers to an adage that says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If somebody punches you and knocks out a tooth, well, they should have a tooth knocked out of that. It's only fair. Um, More formally, this is referred to in theories of justice as lex talionis, right? Lex talionis, the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. There should be a one-to-one correlation between the wrong that somebody did and the consequence or the punishment for that wrong. All right, so this has been Kant in a nutshell. Just as a little bit of a review, we sort of started with the idea of hypocrisy as a kind of launch pad and thinking about that, thinking about how we need to be morally consistent and logically consistent in our moral framework. And Kant uses that to say, well, if all human beings are equal in value, then that means we have to treat everybody equally. We can't treat anybody with more favor than anybody others, much less ourselves or with ourselves not being an exception. Kant insisted that tools and objects have instrumental value. Their value extends only as far as their usefulness, but human beings have intrinsic value. And human beings are valuable no matter what. Even if human beings are useless, they still are valuable because they are human beings. We also talked about the idea that an action declares a moral maxim. Whenever I do something, I am stating that that thing is okay, right? Because remember, otherwise I'd be a hypocrite, right? I can't do something and then say it's not okay. I'd be a hypocrite. I'd be inconsistent. I would be completely contradicting myself. So every action says that it is okay. Everything I do, I am declaring with that action what I am doing is okay. All right. So that means that I should only act in a way that I would be okay with other people doing the same thing. I should only act consistently with that. That it leads to the idea of universalizability. I should behave such that I would be okay with the entire world, acting in the same way. And then that led us to the idea of a categorical imperative. The idea that there are some things that are absolutely wrong, must never be done in any circumstance, regardless of the consequences. Some things are categorically wrong in all situations. Okay, content in a nutshell. I hope this has been very helpful. And in other videos, I will provide more examples and flesh out these ideas. Thanks for watching, and I will see you around the blogosphere.